This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. This evening I am talking to Scott Hamilton. How's it going, Scott?
Oh, good. Yeah, nice day here.
Oh, wonderful. I've been at work, so I've been effectively in a cave, so I don't really know what kind of a day it's been like in Palmerston North, but the peek behind the curtain is that we've been sort of negotiating you driving around with kids, and it sounds like, an excellent time has been had, which is good.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just such a privilege to explore this part of the country, and me as a sort of lifelong Aucklander, I find it hard to process the size of the mountains and the purity of the water in the lakes. So it is a little bit, it's almost like a spiritual experience visiting some of these places, and they look a lot better when you're there than they do on tourist brochures or, advertisements for ice cream. It's lovely, actually.
It's kind of magic, right? We're talking about the South Island, which is where I lived for a long time, and it's striking in a way that is, there are lots of pretty places in the North Island, but the South Island does have a special thing, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, and this has been one of the great cultural controversies, because we've had some great artists and writers from the South Island, and they've emphasised loneliness and separation and the figure on the hills, the empty land. And then those of us from further north, it tends to be a more crowded landscape and often more multicultural too. And so, one of my favourite New Zealand writers, Kendrick Swithyman, he said the South Island is a foreign country. And I think there's some truth in that. It is a profound difference. But, difference is not bad.
No, even pre-colonially, the way in which it was settled by Māori was quite different from the way that the North Island was. So it's got that lingering legacy.
Oh, yeah, and I've been trying to look at some of the historic sites and some of the pa associated with Kaitahu and places like Kokura. It's often, you look at an image and an archaeological report, and then you look at the real thing, and it's about 1,000 foot high and covered in bracken and forest, and the traces of human habitation on the landscape, they seem smaller, and you almost feel like a big wave could wash humanity away. Whereas in the North Island, or the city that I come from, we have scores of volcanoes that were pa, and the presence of humanity seems stronger. So it's quite a different experience to travel here, and I think it's a more radical shift than a lot of overseas travels would be. Within your own country, you can experience this vastly different and quite alien landscape.
Yeah. Speaking of cultural controversies, that was the real reason that I wanted to talk to you. I feel like the way in which ANZAC Day is done recapitulates a lot of essentially propaganda from the period, and it makes it very hard to have any sort of critical discussion about the worth of wars, which I think is a thing that we need to do because wars are incredibly destructive, and the kind of person that they make soldiers into can be very unpleasant, and those people can be, very damaged and all of that stuff. And I saw you kind of trying to have some of these conversations about the legacy of the ANZACs on Twitter. So I thought that would be a productive conversation to try and have.
Yeah, I mean, over the years I've tried to educate myself about the history of New Zealand military and the meanings of ANZAC Day, but also occasionally I've written about it for publications like, I think especially the Spin-Off. I've written for them several times about it. And almost invariably it's resulted in a lot of controversy and sometimes some pretty angry feedback. But I personally see that as a positive thing, and I think that the notion of ANZAC Day as a day where critical thinking and criticism should be absent is actually quite a modern idea. And as I've researched the history of the day, going back in time, there's a whole tradition of controversy around ANZAC Day. Even when, in the very early years of the commemoration, there were profound disagreements about all sorts of things. Interestingly enough, there was a big disagreement about whether crosses should be raised at memorials or obelisks, and with some people seeing obelisks as sort of pagan, and other people really pushing for crosses. And in the interwar period, there was profound ambivalence about ANZAC Day amongst major groups in New Zealand society. For some years, Catholics and Jews tended to avoid the commemorations, so were made uncomfortable by the Anglican theology that was often sort of put into the ceremonies. And there were also dissenters who saw the danger of ANZAC Day becoming a celebration of militarism. And in the 1930s, for instance, there was a group in Auckland called the Committee Against War and Fascism, and they used to hold counter commemorations. The major Auckland commemoration was in the Domain outside the museum, which is, of course, a war memorial museum, and they used to hold their own gatherings outside the museum and sometimes march through the city. And so this is a significant dissenting voice who were concerned that ANZAC Day was becoming militaristic and that it had turned perhaps from a commemoration to a celebration. And
yeah.
I think those are two quite different things.
Yeah, and some of these, I mean, I think it's important to point out. And my source for this is my mum, who has been a lifelong Quaker, and became very very interested in specifically the kind of immediate aftermath of World War I and the way that War and Peace commemoration happened for a while. But she was talking to me about there was a significant contingent of returned soldiers who were very opposed to the idea of war memorials and wanted, peace memorials and peace halls because of precisely that kind of concern. Yes,
that was a real concern, and it's easy to underestimate how strong the disgust towards the First World War was, and how strong was the sort of feeling, encapsulated in that famous phrase, "it should never happen again." There was a tremendously strong anti-militarist element in New Zealand society, and of course that consisted partly of people who'd refused to serve in World War I and been imprisoned, like our future Prime Minister Peter Fraser, but it was also present in some RSA branches. There were resolutions in some Auckland RSA branches in the 1930s against the reintroduction of the draft and militaristic policies. So even within the RSA, there were these dissenters who were concerned about the way things were going. And of course, the Quakers took a very strong anti-war stance right through the period of the First and the Second World War, and sometimes suffered from it. So they're an organisation which really jumps out as being quite consistent in their stance, and is doing some quite heroic things as well. They were one of the very few groups in New Zealand that really pushed for us to accept Jewish refugees in the late 1930s when Hitler was really hounding them out of Germany. And so it's interesting to look at groups like this that were, in a way, going against the mainstream. And when you look at them, you get an alternate sort of take on the history, and you see that the way Anzac Day is often marked today isn't just a simple case of something being handed down by our forefathers. It's a conscious political choice.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the RSA, and that was really interesting to me, because the other thing that made me very, I was already feeling quite ambivalent about Anzac Day, because I was kind of, by being brought up by my mum, who, as I say, was a lifelong Quaker, I was kind of at 90 degrees to the popular conception of how things ought to go to start with. But in the course of doing history at high school, I set myself a topic to look into how the government went about thinking about conscription with regard to, I think, particularly the outbreak of the Second World War. And in the course of doing that, I went and read a lot of back issues of the RSA's own magazine.
Yes.
And that gave me an incredibly jaundiced view of the RSA, because they, within their own internal publication, came off as incredibly kind of jingoistic and like weird sort of glorifications of the capability for violence as well. Like people writing in sort of letters to the editor about how they came across a Conchi on the street, and despite having only one arm, they beat the crap out of him, and isn't this wonderful? Just really kind of weird, vicious stuff, you know?
Yeah, I remember one person asked me, why did we never have a large white supremacist group in the interwar years? We did have a Ku Klux Klan, but it was fairly marginal. And why did we never have a big group? And I said, in all honesty, the RSA was playing that role, certainly through the 1920s. At their 1920 National Conference, they actually passed a resolution calling for a white New Zealand, and they reaffirmed that in 1927. And through those years, they were very, very active in putting pressure on Chinese and Indian migrants and their businesses. There's many, many examples, but one is that sticks in the memory is that in Rotorua there was a Chinese market gardener, and he was able to get a contract with the little hospital there to supply them with food. And the RSA in the area actively campaigned against this. They said it should be a white person. And there was a real fear that the RSA seemed to have. And it was not necessarily something that was coming from the leadership, it was coming from the grassroots, because when you go back and you look, you see that there are all these remits put in at the National Conference by grassroots branches. And they were terrified by the idea that Asiatics, to use one of their words, were going to take the jobs and the livelihoods that belonged to the soldiers who'd fought in World War I. And there isn't a lot of evidence that this was happening, because New Zealand had very draconian anti-immigrant laws by the 20s. And as well as being irrational in that sense, it was also a betrayal, because large numbers of Indian troops fought alongside the New Zealanders in World War I. At Gallipoli, for instance, in 1915, 15,000 Indians fought. So it puzzles and saddens me that they should take such a hard-line attitude towards Indian New Zealanders after the war, when they'd been literally side by side with them in the trenches. And there's no doubt that this is a chapter in the RSA's history which has been neglected, which is possibly unknown by a lot of the members of the RSA today. And when I wrote a piece about it a couple of years ago for the spin-off, there was an almost hysterical reaction. Sean Plunkett was one of the people who reacted very negatively. Not negatively in the sense of saying what you've written is lies, but negatively in the sense of saying this should not be discussed. And I had many, many negative responses along those lines. and even a couple of death threats. And so there's this real fear of discussing subjects like this. That's the paradox of ANZAC Day. It's supposed to be a day when we remember history, but the discussion of history is really frowned upon.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Because you do get all of this talk about preserving freedoms and that sort of thing. And I suppose you can make an argument that in some ways participation in World War II did secure some freedoms, but I don't think you could plausibly make that argument about World War I, which is, very much a kind of tail ends of feudal empires beefing over turf on the other side of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's been a sort of dragooning of the First and the Second World War. They're sort of often yoked together in people's minds, and the progressive aspects of the Second World War, which was obviously fighting Hitler, who needed to be stopped in Europe, those are often, that sort of progressive aspect is often attributed to the First World War as well. People assume that because the fight against Hitler was just, the earlier war must have been just, and of course they're very distinct events. And when I wrote that article I was mentioning earlier, I had quite a number of people contact me and literally say, how do you expect the RSA would feel about Asians after everything they'd suffered from the Japanese? And so you just see an absolute basic failure to distinguish between the two world wars. And the ironic thing, of course, is that Japan was an ally of New Zealand at World War I. And when we sent our troops to Gallipoli, they had a armada accompanying them to protect them from the enemy, make sure the troops got to the Middle East. And one of the ships protecting us was a Japanese ship. So there's just this basic failure to distinguish between the two conflicts. And then within World War II, there's a failure to distinguish between the different theatres of the war. Because while the fighting in Europe was absolutely justified, in my view anyway, by the need to really get rid of Hitler and defeat Nazism, you also had some quite sort of sordid conflicts in other parts of the world which were really just different imperial powers from the Northern Hemisphere fighting over real estate. And there were some inglorious things done there. And certainly today in places like the Solomons and Vanuatu, there are mixed memories of Allied troops, certainly also in Tonga. I visited the grave in Tonga. It's on a hilltop of a New Zealand soldier who was shot by a Tongan in a dispute, and their experience of New Zealand and American troops on their island, their main island, Tongatapu, is very much the experience of an occupation. So even World War II has this complexity, but there's just a real lack of discrimination and public discussion about these conflicts. And beyond the world wars, there are numerous other New Zealand military missions in the 20th century which are just completely ignored. The Malayan emergency in the 50s, our intervention in Fiji in 1920 when we sent troops to crush a strike by Indo-Fijian sugar workers, our intervention on Banaba Island, again to crush a strike by phosphate workers this time in 1925, and then our involvement with the tragic occupation of Samoa at the end of the 20s, the Black Saturday where 8 Samoans were shot dead. These are all doings of New Zealand forces, but we never discuss them.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's really important, right? Because there's this framing whereby people are expected to value things because they were fought for. But to me, that seems like it overlooks the possibility that you could fight for something bad. It's not like the Nazis weren't fighting for something. Should we value the thing that they were fighting for just because people fought for it? But yeah, you're right. I mean, New Zealand has operated as a sort of imperial proxy in this part of the world to be anti-communist and maintain imperial and then, I suppose, capital control over all of these places.
Yeah, well, for me, personally, I think it all makes a lot more sense if we begin at the beginning. And there's a very common belief that the ANZAC tradition begins in 1915 at Gallipoli. And whilst it's true that Australian and New Zealand troops fought there were earlier occasions in the 1860s in New Zealand. And I actually grew up in Drury, and just down the road from the farm where I grew up, there's a little church called St. John's. It was actually used as a sort of a fort and a shelter during the Waikato War. And there's a grave in the back, or a memorial in the back, for half a dozen Australian troops who were killed fighting nearby, out at Tuako, near the Waikato River. And these were Australian volunteers who came over to New Zealand, and in return for fighting in the Waikato War, the invasion of the independent, de facto independent Waikato Kingdom, led by King Tawhiao, in return for taking part in that invasion, they were given land, so they were called soldier settlers. Now, this is really the beginning of the ANZAC tradition. It begins in a nakedly colonial war against an indigenous people in our own country. And the interesting thing is that the Australians seem to recognise this where we don't. The RSL in Australia, they were building a big new war memorial in Sydney in Hyde Park. And several years ago, whilst the construction was going on, they sent a delegation of officials to New Zealand to collect soil from some of the battlefields of the Waikato War. So places like Rangariri and Gate Pa, where there was, a lot of fighting and Australians were involved. And they took the soil back and they stored it in the memorial, along with soil from many other battle sites where Australians had fought, North Africa, for instance, in the 20th century, and Gallipoli, of course. And so they have explicitly recognised the New Zealand roots of the ANZAC tradition and of their own state military tradition. But we seem very squeamish about doing the same.
I mean, that sort of ties into the way in which New Zealand likes to think of our colonisation as somehow more gentle and more civilised compared to the formations of other colonial states, right?
Absolutely. And one ANZAC war crime that I've researched, a few others have too, is the massacre at the village of Surafend at the end of 1918. After the end of World War I, a group of New Zealanders and Australians went into a Palestinian village and killed around 80 adult males. The men were separated from the women and children, and they were killed with just handheld weapons, batons and bayonets, and they were thrown down wells. This was done in retaliation for the killing of a New Zealand soldier by an unknown assailant who fled in the direction of that village. So it's an enormous massacre. And the interesting thing, when you read the acknowledgements of this massacre by soldiers and also by early military historians, they often make analogies back to what the Australians call the frontier wars with Aboriginals, and they compare Arabs to Aboriginals as a supposedly primitive people that need to be colonised and that need to be punished when they step out of line, punished very ruthlessly. So the men that went to war in places like the Middle East in the First World War, they were bringing with them a mental template which was created in the colonial wars of the 19th century. And so there's that same sense of innate superiority, the same sense of the primitive nature of the non-European culture. And so they brought it there. And so to fully understand things like the Surafend massacre, I would argue that we need to recognise that the ANZAC tradition was born in a colonial war. Yeah,
I think, because that attitude carries on in some of the ways in which non-Māori historians have talked about the Māori battalion as well. Like they're our powerful primitive people who we have pointed in this direction and shaped into this force.
Yeah, absolutely. And the early, I was doing some research on the Great South Road once, and the Maori Messenger, which was a newspaper published for the tangata whenua by the New Zealand government, they would often make analogies with ancient Britain. And they would say, you are like the ancient Britons, and we are like the Romans, and we have come to civilize and improve you. And that's why we built roads like the Great South Road, which ended up being the road that was built to bring troops to the Waikato for the war. But there is this conscious analogy being made by the settlers to the ancient world, and they're comparing themselves to Romans. And the way that Maori have been integrated into the armed forces of the state over the last 100 years, has similarities across the British Empire, or the former British Empire. Maori were very quickly identified as a sort of martial people, and according to the racist logic that was popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they were a warlike people. They liked to fight, so they liked blood, and so they were encouraged to join the armed forces. And a whole tradition was created within, which still flourishes within many Maori communities, of identifying with this warrior culture. Now, exactly the same thing happened in India and in Nepal with the Sikh people and the Gurkha people. Once again, you have this image which is created of this indigenous people, of the Sikhs and the Gurkhas. They're great fighters, they're very ferocious, they're martial people. And these groups were brought into the British colonial forces in huge numbers. And to this day, there's a tradition of despite Nepal being obviously independent, there's still a tradition of the Gurkhas joining the British armed forces now. And so Maori were really conceptualized as a warrior people, and then turned into really the foot soldiers of neo-colonial wars. And that's the very tragic thing about wars like Vietnam, is that you have heinous things being done by the indigenous people of another country to the indigenous people of Vietnam. And it's a conscious process which has produced this image of Maori as a martial people. And it's a very crude form of pigeonholing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very reductive thing to look at an entire culture and say all of these people are this kind of thing. Look, we are around about at the halfway mark, and we do take a break here on NPR at this point. So we're going to do that right now, and we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back. You're listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast on Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā Tangata o Manawatu. This evening I'm talking to Scott Hamilton about the complex and difficult legacy of the ANZACs. One of the things that you mentioned, talking about kind of research that you'd done about the First World War and its aftermath, was talking about this massacre that happened, that was perpetrated by ANZAC forces, and I think that's a thing that I keep coming back to, is that there is no army that's clean of that kind of behaviour, and I don't think it's possible for an army to be entirely clean of that behaviour. I feel like it's a thing that happens when you get a group of people and form them into an army, is that they develop this this kind of group consciousness and othering of other people that makes that kind of acting out in some ways almost inevitable. And that's one of the ways that the sort of like we must honour people who fight at all costs makes me very uncomfortable. I guess I wondered if you had any more insight into that.
Yeah, I think that there's an element of ideology where people pick up ideas about other people, but I do feel there's some agency, as you say, there's a certain, the very mechanisms by which armies are trained and the very mechanisms of modern battle, I think that tends to other the enemy and to probably encourage war crimes, really. In terms of the massacre at Surafend, there was certainly, as I said before, analogies being made to 19th century wars, but there's an interesting sort of New Zealand connection as well, in that we had a tradition here of hostility, not only to Chinese migrants like the gold miners, that's something that's fairly well covered and well known, but also towards people who were called hawkers. Now, a hawker was a travelling salesman. They tended always to be men. And a hawker went often from town to town, or small remote community to small remote community, selling things. This is the days before supermarkets. And a hawker often carried local news and gossip as well. Now, quite a significant number of hawkers were called Assyrians by the media in New Zealand when they talked about the phenomenon. And of these Assyrians, a number were really Indians, but a significant number were actually from the Middle East, from countries like Syria and other parts of the Ottoman Empire. And there was a real distrust of hawkers, a hysteria about them, which ultimately resulted in a piece of legislation which William Pember Reeves, one of our prime ministers, helped push through Parliament, and that attempted to limit the activities of hawkers. Now, hawkers were seen as rip-off merchants, people who ripped off good white folk. And when you look at the writing produced by the ANZACs who served in the Middle East, in the mounted rifles of New Zealand and Australia, a lot of these guys were on horseback. You see remarks about the traders in cities like Jerusalem and Cairo, which directly echo this anti-hawker rhetoric. There's this constant complaint that these merchants have no moral values, are ripping them off, are just basically evil. And a bloke called Mills, who wrote a master's thesis on this topic in the late 90s, he revealed that this distrust extended to Jews as well as Arabs. But certainly there was this pigeonholing of Arabs with all these negative characteristics. And it really, I think there's a real echo of the complaints that were being made back home. So I think that the part of the massacre, part of the hatred, the ideology of hatred that made the massacre possible was possibly sown back in New Zealand in this anti-hawker hysteria. And it carried on too, because Surafend occurred when ANZAC troops were waiting, fairly bored, the war was over, and they were waiting to get a boat home. In the beginning of 1919, Britain decided that a significant number of ANZACs were going to have to go to Egypt rather than go home. And that because the Egyptian people had risen up, they were tired of colonial rule, they'd seen the fragility of the British Empire during the war, and they rose up. They were on strike, city after city. They built blockades in the streets. They marched and they demonstrated. It was mostly peaceful, but it was something that Britain couldn't tolerate because they were determined to preserve their colonial rule. So you had thousands of ANZACs sent to Egypt to crush this rebellion. The person who has written the major study of the New Zealand mounted rifles in the Middle East is Terry Kinloch. And he's a military man and takes a fairly conservative view on things. But he nonetheless documents the human rights abuses created in Egypt. He quotes a letter where a New Zealander complains he's getting a sore hand from giving so many whippings to the locals. And the official death toll of this period, when this revolution is being suppressed, is 800 Egyptians died, and only one ANZAC who was an Australian. So it was certainly far too one-sided to be a serious military conflict. And so this is a very important event in the history of Egypt, but it's an event that is really absent from our consciousness in New Zealand. And when you look at the interventions, the armed missions that continued after 1919, the 1920 mission to Fiji, the 1925 mission to Banaba, military follies in Samoa, you can see this whole sort of carry on from First World War. The First World War is not an isolated conflict. You see this whole series of military missions which are motivated by colonial interests and are justified with racist ideology.
Yeah, because I studied. I didn't do it at a tertiary level, but I studied history all through high school, and we got. This would have been at the point at which the TV series of the New Zealand Wars came out. And so we did do a reasonable amount of study of that period of conflict, like within New Zealand, but we got absolutely nothing about New Zealand's various adventures in the Pacific. I didn't find out about the events in Samoa until I met and then married my wife, who is Samoan. That's how I found out that incident had happened, you know?
Yes. And with the growing Pacifica community in this country, these things are being pushed to the fore a bit more. A very great Samoan New Zealand artist in Auckland, Andy Lele, a few years ago he organised a anniversary march to commemorate Black Saturday, when 8 Samoans, including the leader of their independence movement, were shot down by New Zealanders while they were demonstrating in Apia. And this has become an annual thing since Andy Lele kicked it off, and you get quite significant numbers of people there marching to commemorate this event. And as Pacifica people become more influential, I think, in society, more of this stuff will emerge, because whilst it's been forgotten mostly by Pākehā, it certainly hasn't been forgotten by the people who were on the receiving end. So I think it's a part of our history which is going to come into increasing prominence.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that there will be more reevaluation of our participation in the kind of anti-communist campaigns throughout the 50s and 60s?
I think it would be good to have a reevaluation of those, because some of the ideology that we've seen motivating 21st century military campaigns by the US, especially, has echoes of McCarthyite anti-communism. I mean, I'm old enough to have been around and been involved with events in New Zealand after the 9/11 massacre, and there were numerous revenge attacks in New Zealand. Mosques were attacked, bricks through windows, that kind of thing. And there was a period of quite intense Islamophobia. And the way that Islam was presented during that period, even by some mainstream politicians like Richard Prebble, who was leading ACT at the time, it was almost like a disease, an ideological disease that you could catch and it could take over young minds. And there's striking parallels with the way communism was presented back in the 50s. And so I think, if we could step back and appreciate some of the absurdities of the Cold War, for instance, the way I've written about the way that teachers were suspected of brainwashing the nation into communism and were for many years required to say an oath of allegiance to New Zealand and an oath of anti-communism. If we could get a bit of historical perspective on that and say, well, yeah, that looks a bit silly now, doesn't it? We would be better able to deal with current events in a level-headed way. Because 9/11 was an absolutely appalling event, but there is a way that misconceived responses to events like that lead to very long wars. I mean, World War I started with a political assassination, and the almost endless war on terror, began that day. And just more historical awareness can help us to make better decisions.
Yeah, I certainly think that, remembering things is very important. There was a thing that you said that struck me. It's a sort of a digression, but I did find it very interesting, that the way that you're talking about like Islam being portrayed as like a mind virus.
Yes.
It is this kind of recurring rhetorical trope that I've seen where people will pick a way of thinking or a cultural practice that they don't like. Like the New Atheists did it with religion as well, back when Dawkins was something other than kind of a bit of a joke. But like where they would pick an idea they didn't like, and they would treat that idea as having the capacity to like completely transform your mind in a way that's almost kind of magical, without having the conception that any of their own ideas could have any effect on their own thinking. It's very strange.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the anti-communist feeling in New Zealand, it goes back to before the Russian Revolution. It goes back to the 1870s and 80s, because after the Paris Commune of 1871, where you had that radical group linked to Karl Marx ideologically, this radical group of workers took over Paris and sort of proclaimed it a socialist state. The commune was destroyed quite quickly, and a lot of the communards were actually sent to prison camps in New Caledonia. And by the late 1870s, early 1880s, they were finishing their terms there, and quite a number settled in New Zealand. And so we can actually find cartoons from this period worrying about communist infiltration in New Zealand from New Caledonia. So the fear goes way back, and it reappears in different guises. But it's not a fear that's based on rational thinking, really. And for decades between the two world wars, it was virtually impossible to buy and sell Marxist literature. Sid Scott, one of the leading members of our Communist Party, he ran a grocery in Onehunga, and in 1925 the police raided him and took his library away. So it was difficult even to read and discuss this ideology, which was causing so much trouble. And yet just that level of ignorance breeds a fear. And one of the things, just studying the history of racism in New Zealand, is very interesting how quickly a group can be branded as the other, and nasty things can happen to them. I mean, a great example is the Germans in World War I. Before World War I, New Zealand's newspapers, if you read them, are often full of really complimentary articles about Germany. It's seen almost as a model for a industrial country. And then suddenly, in 1914, we go to war, and the newspapers, I think the New Zealand Herald starts calling Germans the Red Indians of Europe, and they're quite widely called the Mongols of Europe. The Hun, of course, was a very popular way of referring to them. And lo and behold, we had anti-German riots. We had one on New Year's in Gisborne. And people went out looking for the Hun and just attacked shops with Germanic names attached to them, whether they were really run by Germans or not. And so it's quite extraordinary how this group goes from being a group which is seen as, they're not British, but they're near enough, they're part of our civilization. And then in the space of a few months, they go to being this despised out-group. And it's just as it shows the way that hysteria can be used to brand any group, really.
And I mean, very much in service of kind of imperial and colonial ends, like the problem with the Germans was that suddenly they were the wrong sort of white people who were in the way of the right sort of white people.
Yeah, I mean, the whole notion of a white race, it is such a porous concept, and groups can be integrated into the white race and then kicked out of the white race. I mean, a contemporary example is Afghans. Afghani people are treated by American census authorities as white. But in popular consciousness, despite the fact that they possess skins that often are fairly fair, they're anything but. They're seen as barbaric and enemies of Western civilization. So they're branded a different colour. And you see this over and over with different peoples. These terms like white, they don't really refer to anything in the real world. They refer to obsessions and paranoia and hysteria. Another group in New Zealand was the Irish, who at various stages, especially in the decade after the Easter Rising of 1916, there was incredible fear of the Irish. They were seen as an alien race and a non-European race. In the early 1920s, the Protestant Political Organisation, which was an extremist anti-Catholic group, they had tens of thousands of members. There was a nunnery that was burnt down in a terrorist attack. And so this it seems absurd to us now because Irish Catholics are so well integrated into New Zealand population. But they were branded as other and they were cast out. So it's something to be aware of, and because it's probably going to happen again. I don't know which group it'll be, but history tells us it'll probably happen again. Yeah,
I mean, it's certainly interesting to watch from the outside which groups. I mean, it's just because it's more visible there in some ways than it is here. It's a bit harder to see things from the inside, I suppose, but see which groups are on their way to becoming, if you like, white, even if they're not necessarily fair-skinned, but, are on their way to becoming part of that sort of, I guess, hegemonic in-group against whom else everybody else gets measured.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Croatians are a good example. During the First World War, they were called Austrians, which is pretty ironic because most of them came from Dalmatia, which was a very unwilling part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was fighting alongside Germany against New Zealand and the Allies. A lot of them came here to get away from conscription. They didn't want to serve in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And yet when the war began, they were branded as Austrians. And there was quite a serious proposal to put them into a massive concentration camp in the far north, above Kaitaia. And a number of them were interned and put to work, and there was tremendous suspicion of them. And that has really waned. And so this is really just a historical issue now, the prejudice against Croatians. But if we're aware of it, then we can watch out for similar eruptions of irrational hatred in the future.
Yeah, I mean, again, remembering things is kind of powerful, but also in some ways a curse because you're forced to watch other people not do it. I mean, the concept we were talking about the anti-communism before, the concept of being a communist is almost a joke in some ways for many modern people. But my granddad was a card-carrying communist, which was a rational thing to be at the time. And my mum had stories that her and her cousins could only play with each other because at that point in Nelson, that branded the entire family as someone that you couldn't have any kind of connection with because you would, catch it through your children.
Yeah, no, there was tremendous anti-communist feeling, and I probably peaked at the end of 1939 when Stalin signed his treaty with Hitler, which was, of course, a grotesque thing to do. And it puzzled a lot of rank-and-file communists because they'd innocently believed that Stalin and the Soviet Union were opposed to fascism, but of course Stalin was for what was good for Stalin. So he signed this treaty, and the Communist Party campaigned against the war for a year or two until the Soviet Union was invaded. And this is the period of the greatest hostility. It's a period when the Labour government banned the Communist Party, and a friend and I actually, we made a visit a few years ago to a cave in Papatoi, and this cave was where the Communist Party was keeping their printing press. So they'd gone underground, both figuratively and literally, and the police eventually raided them after the kids found all these commie newspapers and leaflets. So this is, their main press had been smashed up by the police in a raid, so they went underground. But then again, we see this radical change, because after the Soviet Union is invaded, the Communist Party does a 360, changes their policy, and they become ardent advocates of the war. And when the Soviet Union is clearly defeating Hitler, we see this incredible enthusiasm for Stalin and for communism. And I think in 1944, there was a huge rally in support of the Soviet Union in Auckland at the town hall, and people were singing communist songs. It became briefly cool to be a communist. And this is the period of, I don't know when your forebears were involved, but this is the period of the maximum sort of membership of the Communist Party. It had a tremendous number of members, thousands. And then, of course, the Cold War begins, and everything flips again, and communists become the enemy again. So there's this radical instability in the way that we think about things. It might sometimes seem like prejudices are rock solid and they don't change, but history shows that they do change. And that can, of course, be a good thing as well as a negative thing. Just through my lifetime, I've seen all sorts of prejudices that once seemed invincible sort of melt away. The enormous prejudice against homosexuals and transgender people. I've seen Pākehā, more and more Pākehā come to an appreciation of the tangata whenua.
And willingness to be referred to as Pākehā.
Yeah. And one of the projects that I'm sort of doing is every now and then I'll write about, there is a danger that Pākehā who perceive the colonial past and the terrible things that were done, they develop a nihilistic attitude about themselves. They feel, I'm just this and that, I'm the descendant of land stealers. So it's important. I've been trying to write sometimes about the diversity of the Pākehā population in the 19th century and the way that some of them, the Irish Catholics I mentioned already, actually sided with Maori, and some of them played a really progressive role. And so there's always models, positive models that people can find in the history of their people. One of my favourite guys I've been researching is Michael O'Connor, and he was a Fenian Irishman come out to look for gold in the Coromandel, and he got together with a whole lot of other Irishmen, and they formed a militia, and they had their own flag, they had their own uniform, and he went down to see King Tauwhiao when he was in exile in the King Country after the Waikato War, and offered to form an alliance, an Irish-Maori alliance that would throw the British out of the country. So you get these extraordinary figures that show us that prejudice is not rock solid at any time. There are always dissenters, there are always those who disagree, who fight against it.
So, look, we're coming up on the end of the show, and I think that's an excellent place to leave it, because I kind of end the show often by saying, what recommendations do people have, and in terms of remembering things and I guess trying to inoculate yourself against the kind of unquestioning, our boys were always right and the military is always good, that kind of comes along with Anzac Day. One way of doing that is by looking for that complexity in those dissenting voices and remembering that no group of people is or ever has been a monolith. Do you have other recommendations of like things to read or places to look if people are looking for more depth and more complexity?
Yeah, I mean, wherever you go in New Zealand is history. And, often it's on the surface still. And there's a superb app now which enables people to drive through the Waikato and see all of the sites from the wars, from the terrible invasion of the Waikato and the battles. You're guided by this app. And the more we know about our country, the more at home we feel. I just recently moved to Warkworth, or the Maori name's Puanui, and out of Auckland, so it was quite a big shift for me. And the first things I tried to learn were the name of the mountains, the name of the Monga, and the name of the Awa, the river. And once I learned that, I felt like I was sort of grounded. And I think history is like geography. The more of the history you know, of the place where you live, the more rich and alive that place becomes, and the more you feel orientated. We've got so many things in the 21st century that are sort of pulling us away from where we are. You know, we've got digital technology, we've got screens, we've got social media, we're kind of vanishing into our cell phones. But if we pull back and we appreciate our environment and our history, I think we feel much more grounded and happier, I think.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much for talking today, Scott. Are there places where people can find you and your writing if they want more of you?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book published several years ago called Go South Road. It's the history of the Great South Road, right through the terrible war that was fought there. I'm on Twitter. I tweet away. But it's not just me, we've got a tremendous number of people writing about history in New Zealand, and you don't even need to buy their books. You can go to a public library and you can see them. I won't name any because, it's a bit unfair. We've got a tremendous number of people doing scholarship. And we've also got scholarship going on amongst young people at secondary school level. The group of people that really pushed successfully for a commemorative day for the New Zealand wars, the wars on Maori in the 19th century, they were secondary school students from Otahanga. So we've got emerging scholars as well, and it's all there. Just go to your library.
Excellent. And I guess a parting word from me is that there is more and more, I suppose, particularly around World War I and World War II, there is, it seems to me, more and more awareness of people who dissented against those wars as well. There has been the memorials to conscientious objectors that have gone up recently. So that to me seems like a step in the right direction, that there is some sort of broad acknowledgement that people weren't just kind of 100% in favour of all of these military actions, and nor should people necessarily be 100% in favour of whatever the military does in future.
Absolutely. No, I agree completely. You're talking about conscientious objectors, but we're talking about the diversity within the armed forces. In World War II particularly, people were conscripted, so it's ordinary people fighting, and they often had really viewpoints which were divergent from the views of their commanders. And we have incredible New Zealanders like John Mulgan. Of course, he's famous as the author of the novel Man Alone, but he was a fighter in the Second World War, and he went and he fought with partisans in Greece. Parachuted in, fought against the Nazis, but he later became bitterly critical of the British Empire, because at the end of the war, a lot of his partisan allies, they supported the hunting down and the shooting of them by anti-communists in Greece, and Greece went into a civil war. So Mulgan is someone who wasn't a pacifist, but he will put on a uniform, but your brain doesn't automatically turn off when your uniform goes on. And he was a profound critical thinker. And so people like him need to be remembered as well. We shouldn't think of our soldiers as automatons.
Well, thanks once again, Scott.
No, pleasure to talk to you.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.